Okay, good morning. Good morning. Today the conference is dedicated to the fourth topic, environment. And yesterday we have had the speak to Alessandra Stefani that have talked about the green environment, and now we will continue with this topic and with other fundamental topic for the save of the environment, of the health of the population, of the urban residents. We give the floor to Domenico to present the keynote speakers of today's.
Thank you, Margherita, and welcome back to all. So we have the pleasure and the honor this day to open the session with Dr. Marina Romanello, that is Executive Director of Lancet Countdown, Tracking Progress on Health and Climate Change. So Marina, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. We want to stress very much the importance of the interlinkage between health and climate change. And the floor is yours to start your conversation. Thank you very much, Marina, for being with us.
Thank you all. I'm delighted to be here with you. Thank you so much for this invitation. I was really looking forward to being there in person, but I decided it's not a time to be flying around the world with carbon emissions. So I'm going to have to do this remotely, although just know that it would have been my pleasure to join you in person there as well. I'm going to try and share my screen. Domenico, if you can let me know once you see it live.
Okay, go.
Is that showing?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Right, so as Domenico mentioned, I am the Executive Director for the Lancet Countdown. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the findings of our 2021 report today, but I'm going to put a bit of a special focus in Italy in honor of the place where this meeting is taking place. And I'm going to walk you a bit through what are our big concerns in terms of climate change and health. So for those of you that have not heard of the Lancet Countdown is a big international collaboration. Today in our global team, we have about 100 researchers from about 50 international institutions. As you can see on screen, we have UN agencies, we have leading research institutions from around the world, and obviously we work in partnership with the Lancet. These 100 researchers come together once a year to produce indicators and evidence that monitors the health impacts of climate change and the health benefits or potential benefits of climate action. Our work gets published annually in the Lancet ahead of the COP climate negotiations. Our upcoming report will come out on the 26th of October. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about that later. And these reports with 44 indicators monitoring progress really serve as a way of keeping track of progress against the completion of the Paris Agreement, and above everything, about ensuring that the Paris Agreement does indeed become the biggest global health agreement of the 21st century, as the WHO labeled it. However, our latest report shows not such great findings, the one that we published last year. We're seeing that the health impacts of climate change are worsening across all of the indicators that we monitor, and the situation is getting very fast, very badly, because we're seeing that, for example, when we look at extreme heat exposure of those vulnerable populations to extremes of heat, this is people over 65 years of age and also very young children, is increasing very rapidly. And as you can see in this graph, the present days of exposure, one person exposed to 1 day of heat wave, has increased sharply in the past years, particularly in the last decade, exposing people to potentially lethal events of heat wave, as we have seen throughout last year and the years before, particularly in Europe, where the population is very rapidly aging. Heat exposure is also leading to the loss of labor capacity. If you ever try to do physical activity or physical work outdoors when it's really hot, it is really difficult. It is a potential health risk, and it does entail more breaks, taking shelter, breaking for water. So it does reduce labor capacity. And the reason why that is important is obviously because losing labor capacity means losing income, losing the wealth in general for the national economy, and that directs health through undermining the socioeconomic determinants of health. So it is also a health issue to think that people are losing their capacity to work. And as you can see in this graph, that teal color that you can see here represents the agricultural sector. And here we have countries around the world grouped according to the Human Development Index, that is looking at a proxy for human development. And as I hope is evident from this picture, it is the low Human Development Index and the medium Human Development Index countries that have the biggest losses in the agricultural sector. These are the vulnerable agricultural workers that cannot take shelter, generally lower paid, poorer communities, and generally those on which food security depends. So this has potential cascading effects and ramifications in terms of what that means for food security, for the socioeconomic determinants of health in those vulnerable countries. Obviously, with the rising temperatures, the changing rainfall patterns, we're also seeing an increase in the risk of wildfires and very dramatic and very extreme wildfire seasons around the world. We've seen images that were devastating of Greece, of Sicily. Sicily was heavily affected, obviously, as you know, last year during the heat waves, California, Canada, even Siberia. And as you can see in this graph, most of the countries around the world are seeing an increase in the exposure of people to days of very high or extremely high risk of wildfire. So people are more and more at risk of exposure to wildfires, which are not only a direct threat in terms of potential injuries, but also exposure to smoke and loss of assets. Again, loss of the of wealth and of potential infrastructure, undermining the socioeconomic determinants of health. If we look a bit more at Italy, there's something that is pretty concerning that I think became very evident this year, that is threats to food and water security. We're seeing that because of the rising temperatures, as you can see in this graph, the crop yield potential for all major staple crops grown in Italy is reducing. The higher temperatures means that crops mature more quickly and therefore the yield is lower, the potential yield is lower. So all of the main crops in Italy are reducing their crop yield potential. And Italy has seen a very, very extreme drought this year. And as you can see in this graph, the percentage of land area that is affected for 1 month or more to extreme drought or to exceptional drought is increasing very sharply, particularly since the year 2000. And we're seeing that an additional 41.6% of the Italian land area experienced at least 1 month of drought since the 1950s. Almost 50% of Italy is seeing droughts, which didn't used to see before kind of the 1950s. So obviously very concerning findings for food security, water security, and that became acutely visible this year. And obviously another thing that is of very high concern, and I think you might have touched upon this throughout the conference, is the potential for the spread of infectious diseases. Because temperatures are getting hotter, because rainfall patterns are changing, because humidity is changing. We're seeing that more and more diseases that were generally found only around the tropics or were not so frequent in colder latitudes are starting to emerge. And that is the case for dengue that you can see here in the slide. The basic reproduction potential for dengue has increased in Italy since the 1950s, is now 31% higher than it was in the 1950s. It's still very low, as you can see, still well below 1, that would be the outbreak potential threshold, but still this increase is concerning. And as you can see in the map, the gradient is more towards the north, so the increase in the potential of transmission is seen obviously where the conditions were colder before. So what this means is that in the summer in particular, once there's introduction of dengue, the mosquito Aedes albopictus is established, there is potential for local transmission. And this is something that needs to be monitored. And just like dengue, we're seeing more and more infectious diseases starting to emerge in latitudes where we did not find them before, particularly in Europe with things like West Nile virus, with Lyme disease, etc. So with all of this, and with the situation of climate change becoming so dire, we're now at 1.1 degree of warming, and we're already seeing all of these impacts. You would think that keeping temperatures as well below 1.5 as we can is essential, because at 1.1 degree, we're already seeing devastating impacts. However, when we look at the single biggest source of emission, the energy sector, the findings are not very encouraging. We're seeing that just since 2014, at the pace of decarbonization of the energy system that we're seeing, it would take us 150 years to fully decarbonize the global energy sector. And bear in mind that we do have the technology. The energy sector is one of the ones that we can decarbonize most easily, because we do have the technology to produce energy in a sustainable way. If you look here at Italy, Italy did some progress. Is the kind of the pinkish line that you can see here, going from 65 tons of CO2 per terajoule of energy produced to something around 55. So there is a good reduction, however, not nearly at the pace needed. This is really not nearly at the pace needed. We need to be at net zero by mid-century, and that will not happen at this rate. So we're not in track. And beyond the threats of accelerated climate change, the reason why the energy sector is so worrying for the health sector is obviously because of exposure to ambient air pollution. Ambient air pollution, particularly PM2.5, that is the small particulate matter, the most harmful form of air pollution, is contributing to around 3.3 million deaths every year. We know that about 1/3 of those, about 1 million deaths per year globally, are directly attributable to the burning of fossil fuels. And what you can see here is what that data looks like for Italy. Italy is the European country that has the second highest mortality attributable to PM2.5 air pollution. About 8% of total deaths of all natural causes in Italy have to do with ambient PM2.5. And if you see here, what are the sources of contributions? The household sector is a major source of contribution. The transport sector, particularly in urban areas, also a very big contributor. So very important to decarbonize these two sectors, households in particular. If we look at the household energy mix, there's still a very big over-reliance on dirty fuels in the domestic sector at a global level. Italy is not the exception. Italy uses a lot of biomass in the domestic sector. But if we look at this globally, there's also very sharp inequities. Again, here you have countries stratified according to their Human Development Index grouping, low, medium, high, and very high Human Development Index. And what I want you to focus on here are the lines. This dashed line in the middle represents the total percentage of the population that has access to clean fuels for cooking in their home. This is data from the World Health Organization. The dotted line here is the urban sector of these countries, and the solid line is the rural sector. So I hope you can see that in the very high Human Development Index countries, there is very good reliance on clean fuels for cooking. But as Human Development Index reduces, we're seeing that more and more the population lacks access to clean fuels in their homes, particularly for cooking, where there's a lot of direct exposure, particularly of those in charge of doing the cooking. And if we look at the low Human Development Index countries, only 5% of the rural households had access to clean fuels. That is pretty outrageous, because this means exposure to enormously high levels of air pollution in their homes. Obviously, with the energy crisis that we're seeing now, this is likely to get even worse as people cannot afford cleaner fuels, and as we have not enrolled renewable energies, particularly for the domestic sector. But what is perhaps more concerning is that despite all of the health impacts of climate change to which fossil fuels are contributing, all of the health harms of direct fossil fuel emissions and exposure to their air pollution, we're seeing that 77% of the 84 countries that we studied around the world still subsidize, still provide net total subsidies to fossil fuel burning. So we're still encouraging through financial incentives the burning of the fossil fuels that are harming our health and threatening our global health and our survival in the future. What this graph shows you is the total amounts of funds that countries are allocating to burning of fossil fuels or to fossil fuel subsidies as a percentage of their health budget. And as you can see here, about 10% of the countries that we studied still allocate more funds to the subsidizing of fossil fuels than they do to their total health budget, clearly showing the lack of prioritization of health. Italy was the country in the EU that most resources allocated to the burning of fossil fuels in 2018. It allocated a total of almost $9 billion US, about 5% of its total health budget. So that is an enormous amount. And that is basically why it's so hard to decarbonize, for incentivizing fossil fuel burning. However, not all is bad news. There's still some reason for hope. I told you about the energy sector and how important it is to decarbonize it. Between 2013 and 2018, we're seeing that the energy generated from clean renewable sources, solar energy, wind energy, increased by an annual average of 17% year on year. That is a very high rate. It's very easy to have a high rate when you start from practically zero. So it's easy to have a high rate at the beginning. But if this was kept, this level of rolling out was kept, then we would still have hope. Perhaps the most encouraging finding is that if you see in this graph, it's countries like China, the US, Germany, India, some of the biggest contributors to global CO2 emissions that are doing the fastest progress. So that is also enormously encouraging. However, it is still only 7.2% of the global share of electricity that comes from these new renewables. It's still very, very low amount. This has to go to 100% really fast within the next 10, 20 years. But perhaps the most encouraging finding comes from the health sector. The health sector contributes roughly to 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. At least that's the data we had for 2017. This hasn't changed much. Countries that have very big health systems, very expensive health systems like the US, like Canada, they tend to contribute more to global emissions. In Europe, countries in general are more efficient in the use of resources, but they still contribute an enormous amount to greenhouse gas emissions. And if we understand that greenhouse gas emissions are harming our health through all of the health impacts of climate change and are undermining a healthy future, it is imperative that health systems urgently decarbonize to ensure that they're providing care without doing harm. So what I'm showing you here is a map of countries that abided to the COP26 health commitments. This was an initiative that was part of the COP26 health program, in which countries were encouraged to commit to providing sustainable, low carbon or net zero health systems. And as you can see, 75 countries committed to low carbon or net zero health systems around the world. Again, many of them did net zero commitments. Some of those net zero commitments go to 2050, which is where everyone would have to go to net zero. So it's very important that the health sector accelerates and increases this ambition to ensure that we're at the forefront and ensure that we are protecting health of global populations from climate change. But very encouraging findings from the health sector. And I do encourage you all to look a bit more at the decarbonization and resilience commitments. So with that, I will just close. And I will just want to invite you to join us for the global launch of the 2022 report of the Lancet Countdown, which will be launched publicly through an event, an online event on the 26th of October. And the save the date will come out very soon. But in the meantime, if you want to see more about our indicators, our data, please do visit lancetcountdown.org. And if you follow us on Twitter, you'll get the news on upcoming launch events throughout the world. That is it for me, and thank you so much for your attention.